So there are some words in the English language that I find very difficult. Actually, did you know English is one of the most complicated languages to learn in the world, because we talk about all these rules that are part of English, and then we change those rules for certain words. And they become difficult to pronounce, difficult to enunciate. So I want to share some of those words with you, and my promise is you'll probably never hear me say them in a sermon other than this one. So here's the first one, rural. That's a hard word to say. Some of you say rural. Rural, right? Is that the way, right? Do we all say it that way? Rural. A complicated word, right? Hard, difficult to say. Here's another one, colonel. Why in the world has that word got an R sound with no R letter? When I was a kid and we'd play Clue, we called him Colonel Mustard, because that's what phonics told us to call him. There's the next one I said wrong in first service. I'm still not sure how to say right. Anemone is, somebody help me in the front, thank you. Anemone, something like that, but it's not anenema or anything like that. It's very different. You gotta be careful with that one. Next one's my favorite. I'm still not quite sure. But somebody told me you say Worcestershire. Worcestershire. But why do we have the CES in there? It should say Worcestershire. That's how we spell it. It's very difficult to say. The next one's equally difficult to say. Otorhinolaryngologist. Something like that. We call them ear, nose, and throat guys. Much simpler, right? Go see your ENT instead of that. Very difficult. But there are some words that don't look as perplexing as that one, but are maybe more difficult to say. There's a set of words that I think we have a hard time sputtering out in certain situations. Simple words, complicated meaning. I forgive you. Isn't it interesting that on a list of words that we're having fun with, that are so hard to say, so hard to get out and say right, one of those would be something like, I forgive you. We have an incredibly difficult time saying that phrase. There's one that's equally like it. Please forgive me. Sometimes it's much easier to say, well, I'm sorry, but difficult to say, please forgive me. They're loaded, right? It's not hard to spell those words or say those words, but the meaning inside of them gets us all kinds of tied up, gets us all kinds of hesitant. And everybody in this room, I don't know what situation you came from into this day, but all of us have these relationships that have a chasm or a gap between us and another person. And somewhere in that gap are these words, I forgive you, or please forgive me. And if we would just grab onto those, we could bridge the gap. But they're so hard to say. They're so hard to get out. They're so hard to, in a lot of ways, pronounce. We allow relationships to remain distant and separated and broken. All because it's just too hard to say those words. For some of us, it's a business relationship. Somebody you work with at the office. Or maybe it's some contractor that comes in and you work with periodically, and there was some kind of misunderstanding along the way. Or a deal fell through somehow. And it was your fault or their fault or some combination of both. And for whatever reason now, you don't talk, you don't communicate, you avoid each other at the water cooler and all of that simply because someone's not willing to say, please forgive me. Or maybe they have said that and the other person's just not willing to say, I forgive you. And isn't it interesting that as we start talking about this, there's this little voice in our head that's going, yeah, if they would just say it, right? For others of us, it's a friendship that's fallen apart. We shared some piece of information with someone other than that person. And the relationship has deteriorated ever since. And we're just not willing to say, please forgive me. Or, I forgive you. For some of you, it's a child, or a parent, Your relationship is broken. And there's this piece of you that understands. If that set of simple words would just come out of your mouth in the presence of the other person, things could be drastically different. For some of you, it's your marriage. And an affair happened, or financial situation caused strain on the relationship, and you have become distant and broken, and it's nothing but fights. And if we would just say those words, things would be different. Because if we went around the room, listen, if we sent a mic around and we asked everybody to share, we're not going to do that, but if you all shared and I asked you after you shared, are you happy with that situation? I would bet my life on the fact no one would say yes. Not if you were being honest. Most of us are not satisfied with our relationships being shattered and broken and so distant. But we sit back and we go, there's just been too much time. There's been too much said. There's just too much bitterness. And we've lost hope for that relationship. And the words, I forgive you, seem impossible. Now, I wonder why. Why? They're just words. It's because of what they mean, right? It's because it's so loaded. For some of us, it feels like we're throwing in the towel and we're giving up. It's us saying we were wrong and we don't think we're wrong. Or it's us, somehow we think saying I forgive you means I condone what you did. And so we have a hard time saying it. We refuse to go in that direction. But for the last month or so, we've been reading about this guy named Joseph. And if ever there were anyone that had reason to have broken relationships with his family, it would be Joseph. You'll remember his brothers contemplated murdering him in cold blood. They sold him into slavery. I mean, if anybody had reason to be distant and fail to say, I forgive you or whatever, it would be him. But what we're going to see today is nothing short of miraculous. And Joseph shows us in a couple different ways what real, true forgiveness looks like and what it takes to get there. So I want to look at Genesis chapter 42 this morning, if you've got your Bible or you want to pull it up on your phone. Genesis chapter 42. And the context before we start reading is this. You'll remember that Pharaoh had had some dreams that Joseph had interpreted for him, and there was this promise of really good years followed by really bad years, full of famine. And we are at this time in the famine, right in the heat of it. And Joseph has been put in charge, and he's taken really good care of all of the crops and all of that stuff in those good years, and now Egypt is the hub of the universe, so to speak, because they have food for people that are hungry. Because again, we're in the middle of a famine. So chapter 42, pick it up in verse 6. It reads, Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, so they've come from where they live to get food, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Sound familiar? It sounds like the dream. Remember the dream way back when we first met Joseph? He had this dream, and God told him what this means is your brothers are going to bow down before you. And that's what got him in all kinds of trouble with them. But here, God is actually playing out the plan. And his brothers are literally on their faces in front of him. I love it when we get to see God promise something way back and then fulfill it in the future. So his brothers are bowed down before him. Verse 7, as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Now Joseph is faced with what I think are three options here. His brothers are down before him. He's in the position that he's in. And here's what he could do. He could say, hey, it's me. Let's have a hug. and a kiss, and let's just make this all go away and put it in a bubble and it's all over with. He could do that, right? Nobody's signing up for that, though. Or he could have done this. Hey, it's me, Joseph. I told you you'd bow down before me. That's a viable option. I don't know that most of us would fault him for that. But the third option is the one that he goes with: distance. Joseph chooses to keep himself separated from the people that have offended him. And he creates a new kind of relationship that I want to label this morning. I want to call it virtual strangers. He becomes virtual strangers with his brothers. Now, you could read this and you go, Joseph, you are a miserable human being. I can't believe you wouldn't just forgive them. I can't believe that you would just not be okay with it. Isn't that the godly thing to do? Why would you create distance? Why would you continue to treat them like they're strangers in your life? But if we took a breath and we thought about our own lives, you have virtual strangers too. You know what the crazy part is? Most of them have the same last name as you. We have all kinds of relationships in our lives that have space and distance, and we treat each other like we're strangers because of some history that happened, and we refuse to give in. And so Joseph carries on as if he doesn't know who his brothers are. And isn't it interesting that Joseph can't control any of the stuff that's happened to him? None. He can't control the fact that his brothers wanted him dead, that they sold him into slavery. He can't control the whole thing that happened with Potiphar and how he ended up in prison. He can't control any of that. The only thing he can control right now is how he responds to his brothers. And we don't always think about that. We don't always think about the fact that we have options when we find ourselves in relationships like Joseph is in right now. And as chapter 42 goes on, he begins to employ very distinct tactics on how he's going to maintain this virtual stranger relationship. The first one that we've already mentioned several times is distance. He keeps himself separated from them. As you read chapter 42, it says that Joseph continued to speak to them through an interpreter. Now, Joseph speaks the language that they speak. But again, he wants to maintain this buffer between him and his brothers. And so he talks to the communicator talks to them. It's like the inverse of junior high when you had a crush on someone. Hey, will you go ask them if they like me? Right? That's what Joseph is doing here. Tell them this, and then they tell them, and it goes like this. And we do that all the time. I'll go to that family dinner as long as you're going to be there so you can be my buffer. We've said those words. We employ the tactic of distance in relationships that we've been hurt in, and we keep them at arm's length. Then in chapter 42, he also uses another tactic that I would just call deflection, where he diverts attention from the uncomfortable reality that is his family. And at some point, he calls them spies. He accuses them of being spies and that he's going to throw them in jail, and he makes this big stink about all of that instead of talking about the elephant in the room. And I know we never do that. By the way, I'm really good at that. I'm thinking about writing a book so you would have notes on how to be the worst deflector in the world. You would be amazed at how many times Heidi and I will be in a disagreement or a conversation, and I come to the reality that I'm losing, and so I bring up something from like 18 months ago, and I make it about that instead of the actual problem, and that's what Joseph does. You're spies! Instead of saying, you're my brothers, and we've got a problem here. We all do this. We deflect from the real situation and make it about something else. He also, I'm kind of making this one up, he detains them. He realizes that Benjamin's not there, and he plays dumb a little bit and gets them to say that they have this younger brother, Benjamin, but he stayed home with dad back in Canaan. And Joseph says, well, I'm not going to give you anything unless you bring your younger brother here. So I'm going to keep you all in jail until you go get him and bring him back. And there's this conversation. It ends up one brother stays in prison. Now here's something interesting about prisons. They're built to remind you of what you did. Every time you look at those bars, every time you lay on that bed, every time you get that lunch tray, you are reminded of what you did wrong. You're imprisoned to it. And we may not do that physically, but we do that emotionally and verbally with the people that have hurt us all the time. We detain them in their wrongdoing. We remind them over and over and over again, you hurt me, I blame you, it's your fault. This went wrong because of that thing that you did. It's on you all of the time. We imprison them to their wrongdoing. We don't allow them to move on, and we don't move on. We stay right there. And then finally, he makes them deserve forgiveness. In a lot of ways, he begins to make them earn it. And you're going to see in a minute, he starts to put them through this series of tests, making them feel bad. And you're going to see over and over again, we hear about them bowing down. And we do this too. Make the people in our life deserve forgiveness. A lot of us have a hard time saying that word, not because the words are hard to say, but because we don't think they deserve to hear them. They haven't earned it. So we don't give that stuff away for free. So chapter 42 ends, chapter 43 begins. And if you jump down to verse 26, they've gone and gotten Benjamin and come back, and verse 26 is kind of when they see each other again for the first time. It says, when Joseph came home, they presented to him the gifts they had brought into the house, and they bowed down before him to the ground. There it is again. He asked them how they were, and then he said, how's your aged father you told me about? Is he still living? They replied, your servant, our father, is still alive and well, and they bowed down, prostrating themselves before him. As he looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? And he said, God be gracious to you, my son. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. After he had washed his face, he came out and, controlling himself, said, serve the food. They served him by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that is detestable to Egyptians. And it's funny to me that Joseph isn't arguing with this cultural norm. In fact, I think he's appreciating it. Well, I can't eat with you. We got to eat separate. Because as far as they know, he's not a Hebrew, but they are. And so they keep the distance going. They keep the separation going. But Joseph's heart betrays him. And he has to go into this place by himself so that he can cry, because in his heart of hearts, he's not pleased with the reality of his relationship with his brothers. And you know what that tells me? You might be able to play hard, like it doesn't bother you that your relationship is broken with so-and-so. And you might be able to show up at work functions or family functions or go out on date night and pretend like nothing's bothering you, but in your heart, you know there's a problem. And you're not happy with that problem. And you wish it was different. And what's amazing is that a lot of us, if you flip the coin, would go, well, I'm not going to forgive them or ask for forgiveness because they don't act like they want it. They're so cold and distant and removed. But what we don't know is that maybe the night before they cried themselves to sleep over the relationship between you and them, like Joseph. You see, you don't know what's happening backstage. We always only give everybody our front stage, our best, our put together, our polished. And what I love is we get a crack in the door and we see that Joseph is broken over this. He's playing hard, he's playing cold, but in his heart, he's suffering. And so he initiates this series of tests that I just call the Silver Cup fiasco. If you read it, because I know you don't have anything else going on later this afternoon, you could spend the afternoon reading Genesis, and you'll hear about this situation where Joseph puts the silver cup in his brother's bag, Benjamin's bag, in fact. And there's all this worry that, well, that guy's going to kill us because they still don't know it's their brother. And like I said, he does this long series of tests with them. He put money in their bag, the first trip, and all kinds of stuff. Now, I was reading through it. I came to understand or get some clarity on the kinds of tests that he's giving them. First kind of test is one of conscience. He's trying to assess, have they changed in the way that they think? Do they think differently? Or are they the same jerks that only think about themselves? And I know, we don't ever test anybody before we forgive them. So it's just Joseph's brothers. Then he gives them a second test about character. This is more about who they are like in their core. Have they changed? Are they different? Third test is about compassion. Do they care? And here's what I'm thinking about this. When we get this glimpse, I don't know that God is giving us so much about Joseph as it is about, here's what you need to understand someone who's been offended is looking for. You see, Joseph starts testing him in all these ways, and I wonder if God isn't giving us a behind-the-curtain look at when you mess with someone and you offend them or hurt them or crush them, you need to know that they're going to be looking for changes in you when it comes to your conscience, your character, and how compassionate you are. You might say it this way. Someone is going to want you to own it. If you are the offender, you've got to understand they want you to own it. That it's yours, your mistake, your wrongdoing. That's what Joseph wanted for his brothers, from his brothers. It's not enough, I've learned, to just say, well, I'm sorry for how I made you feel. Or I'm sorry that I offended you. That's not ownership. Ownership is, I did this. And it was wrong, and I shouldn't have, and I am sorry. Please forgive me. That's ownership. Now, please, do not think that I'm saying this is easy. I'm terrible at it most of the time. But I've learned that people that I've hurt are looking for me not to just apologize for how I made them feel, but to actually own my behavior. Second, they want to know that you understand it. That when you think about it, you can understand not only what you did, but why it would make them feel the way that they feel. And then last, they want to know that you feel it in your heart. That it's not just some random cognition kind of thing, but that you actually feel remorse and sorrow over it. And again, I'm learning this the hard way. Oftentimes when my wife and I will get into a disagreement, I'll say, I'm sorry. And she'll follow up with, are you really? And usually that makes my blood pressure go up here. But I know what she's looking for. Do I feel it? Do I actually feel bad? Do I actually care? Do I understand how I made her feel the way that I feel? And do I get that it's my fault? That it's on me. Not easy, but necessary. And I love that God gives us this peek into the psyche of someone who's been tragically, horrifically hurt by someone else. And we get some notes on, okay, when we're trying to reconcile ourselves with them, this is going to be some of the things that they're looking for, because it's what Joseph was looking for from his brothers. And then, as a result of that interaction, the miracle happens. And in verse 45, Joseph reveals to his brothers that it's him, that he's their brother that they threw in the pit. And this is what happens as a result. Look at verse 14. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. This relationship is on its way to full restoration, but it doesn't stop there. Look at verse 16. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me." Ready? "I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land. You are also directed to tell them, do this. Take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all of Egypt will be yours." Come on now. Most of us look at forgiveness and reconciliation as on the other side of it, it's going to be somehow less than before it. Because, again, we feel like we're giving in, we're throwing in the towel, we're condoning behavior. And so forgiveness is just going to be this wasteland after. Yes, we'll have done the Christian thing, but it's wasteland after. But what we see in Joseph's life is this whole new story that's being written. Real reconciliation with real fruit. Hugs and kisses and all of that kind of stuff. And then there's this new life that they're being promised. There's more life after the reconciliation than there ever was before. There's no virtual strangers anymore. And I am not a health and wealth guy. But I do believe that God blesses us when we forgive others. I do believe that life is better after we reconcile ourselves with someone that we've been distanced from. But what it takes is both the offender and the offended to become second. So this is the way that I've been thinking about how this all works together. Back to art class. You remember the color wheel? Right in the center of the color wheel are three colors. Remember what they are? Red, blue, and yellow. Those are the primary colors. Then there's this ring that goes around those primary colors. They're called secondary colors. And you get secondary colors when you mix two primary colors together. Eric helped us understand this a little bit at the top of the service. When you put red and blue together, you get purple. Purple is a secondary color. And then there's even tertiary colors, and probably really even more complicated words beyond that for other colors. But what happens when you mix two colors together is you get more colors. But you got to be willing to be a secondary color to have that kind of vibrancy and life. And so I think about it like this. We have these virtual strangers in our life. And so I'm going to play with this little toy here, and we'll see if this works. Some of us, we're a primary color ourselves. We're about us, how we feel, what we think, what we want from life. And then there are people in our lives that are a different primary color. And we seem to always call them red because that's like evil, right? And we keep those two separate because both are thinking primary, both are thinking me, both are thinking what I need, want, and feel. But what Joseph says is if you would be willing to reconcile yourself to that person that you've been distanced, become a secondary kind of color, you get a whole new color. Because when you put red and blue together, it becomes purple. And most of us would look at that and say, well, that's just one color, that's purple. And I would say, no, that's two colors. That's red and blue. So in a secondary color, there's actually more color than a primary color. And when you apply that to the realities of our relationships, I do believe when you take two people and you reconcile them together, it's not this whole new thing. It's just two colors are together and it's better. That's what happens as a result of Joseph's life. And so you might be green. And if you would be willing to mix yourself with that red person again and reconcile and get a little bit messy and you add them in, all of a sudden you have yellow-orange. And there's more color there on that screen right now than when it's just this. There's more life. And here's the really cool part. Remember week 1, I told you we were going to come back to this over and over again. This idea that there's more God in every situation than we think. And when you start mixing all of the colors together, you end up with white. And there becomes God in the middle of your relationship. And that's really what Joseph's life was all about. God in the middle of his circumstance. God in the middle of his situation. And so this is what I'm learning from him over and over again, is that bitterness leads to emptiness, but forgiveness leads to wholeness. And that's very simple, I get that. But we don't always live as if we understand it. Bitterness and anger and holding on to stuff and grudge and all of that, that leads to emptiness. You remain a primary color, one single color. But if you would be willing to forgive, that brings you together and you're whole. The family in Joseph's life is restored, and there's more color there then than ever before. And so there's this amazing verse that we skipped over on purpose because I want to come back to this idea after we've established that there's more life, there's more God in forgiveness. Look at verse 5 of chapter 45. And now, do not be distressed. This is Joseph talking to his brothers. And do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. You see, Joseph was able to see God in even this broken relationship with his brothers. And when he saw that, forgiveness became much easier. And here he is saying to his brothers, don't even be angry with yourselves about it, because look what God did as a result. Even though we meant it for bad, he did good with it. And it forces you and I, in our virtual stranger relationships where we're distant and we've detained and we've deferred and all of that kind of stuff, we have to ask ourselves the question, what has God done through this? Hard. Really hard. But I think it's the first step in reconciliation. Moving away from retribution and punishment and holding things against them and making them feel eternally horrible. It helps us move towards forgiving them. Bitterness leads to emptiness. Forgiveness leads to wholeness. Now later on, you might be sitting with your life group or over lunch with some people after church talking about what we've talked about, and someone might say, that's a great Old Testament story. And Joseph was this really great man of God. Of course that's how the story ends. He comes back together with his brothers and makes all things right. That's how it's supposed to go. I want to show you a verse from the New Testament that's going to really trip you up. It's from Colossians chapter 3, it's verse 13. Paul writes this, bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. Nobody gets off the hook. What's incredible is that forgiveness that Paul mentions from Jesus that's been given to you and me was given to us before we asked for it. Remember, Christ died for us while we were still sinners, while we were still the offenders, while we were still distant and we didn't even know who he was. He did something that would offer forgiveness to you and I. He took initiative. Joseph took initiative and said, it's me, Joseph, listen. All is forgiven. That's the kind of people that we are supposed to be. Not the kind of people that wait for the other person to do it. Not the kind of people that punish them until they're so beat down that we feel like we won something, but people that forgive first. And so here's reality. It's on you. It's on you. Because just like Joseph, you don't get to control what happens in life. You don't get to control the fractures that come up in your family and in your friendships and in your marriage. Sometimes those things happen to you. But what you can control is how you respond to it. What you can control is the decision you make between emptiness and wholeness. What you can control is, are you going to live in a wasteland of broken relationships, or are you going to live in a life where it's vibrant and full of color because you've done the hard thing and asked for forgiveness or given forgiveness where it was asked for? That's the kind of people that we're supposed to be. Now, if you go to the dictionary and you look up the word forgiveness, you're going to get the dictionary definition. But John Ortberg, who's a great speaker writer, gave an incredible definition in something that I read by him recently that I think is the biblical definition of forgiveness. It's the definition that Jesus lives out with you and me. And it goes like this. Number one, this won't be dwelt on. I won't imprison you for this. I won't remind you of this over and over and over again. I won't beat you over the head with it. 2, this won't be brought up later. And 3, this won't be brought up with others. That's forgiveness. That's wholeness. It's not to say that the pain goes away or that the hurt goes away or that you should never have a discussion about that. But what it does is it makes reconciliation the goal. What it does is it puts God at the center of the relationship instead of you. What it does is it makes you secondary and him primary. And when we do that, we move towards wholeness. Bitterness leads to emptiness. Forgiveness leads to wholeness. Now, it would be so easy for this to be another one of those sermons where you sit in here and you nod along the whole time. Sounds good, man. So-and-so needs to hear this sermon. And then we go home and we turn on the game and we forget all about this. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. You were given a card when you walked in today that looks like this. It says a note on the front. And you'll notice that on the back side of that card, it looks like a postcard. Because here's what we're going to encourage you to do this morning. Take the first step. Take the first step in reconciling yourself to those relationships that are broken. And here's what it might look like. You don't need to put on there, in fact, I would encourage you not to put on the message side, I forgive you. You might put, please forgive me. But the best thing you could do would be, hey, can we get together for coffee? I know we haven't talked in a long time. And I know that there's a lot of pain. But I would love to sit down and talk. Here's my number. It's a big step. And would take a lot of courage. But the great news is that we're not told to do this alone. That God will give you strength to do it. But you got to wrestle with, do you want wholeness or do you want emptiness? Which one? Forgiveness is the path to wholeness. And you might be sitting here this morning and you go, I'm still too hurt. I'm still too angry. There's still been too much time. And this seems dumb to just send them that. So this is what I'll challenge you to do. You put this on your refrigerator. And you don't take it down until you're taking it to the mailbox. Write the note, whether you're going to send it or not. But if you're not going to send it, put it on your refrigerator. And you don't take it down until you're going to put it in the mailbox. And it might be 2025. But you leave it there until you're ready to take it down and put it in the mailbox. Because we are going to be a community of people that forgive. That value reconciliation and God being at the core and center of everything that we are, everything that we say, everything that we do. Because that's what He called us to be. So we'll take big, bold, difficult steps to do that. So the band's going to come out in a minute. They're going to play a song for you. I'd love for you to listen to the words. And maybe while they're singing, you start writing your note. Simple. And maybe on the way home, you drop it in the mail. So I want to pray for you, and then we'll continue on. God, we are so thankful that you are a God that's given us an example. You're not a God that calls us to do anything that you haven't already done. And we want to be like you. Part of us growing to be like you is to become people who forgive. People who don't stay comfortable with distance and keeping people in prison to what they've done wrong. But people who reconcile. Lord, it was you that said, if you're at the altar and you've got a problem between you and another person, you go and you reconcile yourself to them. You go and you make things right and then come back and worship. That's huge, God. This is a value to you. And so my prayer is this, that my friends could not sit still while they watch the game until this has been taken care of. Help us, God. Amen. You know, I was thinking backstage, I hear a lot from people outside of a church that say things like, I would love to be a part of a vibrant, life-giving church. And I know what's going through their heads. I want to go to a church where people are clapping and singing and there's lights and there's music and there's engaging teaching and there's all of this kind of stuff. And I'm convinced that that's all wrong. A vibrant church, a church with all kinds of life and color, is one that forgives. That's a vibrant church. So my hope for you, my prayer for you, is that you go, as you go back to work and you go back to home and you go back to reality where there's all kinds of virtual strangers, that you would not be satisfied with that, but that you would be a forgiver. Before you go, if you're relatively new to Emmanuel, our welcome room's open. On your way out, we'd love for you to pop in. We won't keep you long. We'd just love to say hi, get to know your name. We are so glad that you've been with us this morning. We hope that it's been life-giving to you. And we'll look forward to seeing you next Sunday. We'll see you in 7 days.